The man we know as Saint Francis stands barefoot in the central plaza of Assisi, tearing his clothes off piece by piece. His eyes burn with a fanatic's fever as he hurls insults at church authorities who watch in horror. The crowd gasps when he renounces not just his father's wealth, but the church's very authority. This isn't the gentle saint who preached to birds and founded a humble brotherhood. This is Francesco Bernard I, a radical extremist publicly declaring war against the most powerful institution of medieval Europe. What history remembers as an act of sacred poverty was actually the first shot in a dangerous campaign that nearly brought the Catholic Church to its knees. The gentle saint of your children's books would become the Vatican's most terrifying nightmare. You felt the shock of that opening. Now imagine opening your history book and finding almost none of it. That violent plaza, the torn garments, the public renunciation, these scenes do not sit comfortably on the classroom page. What you were taught instead is a softer, simpler story. We'll rehearse that official version now, the neat sermon that generations inherited and still repeat with good intentions. Most people meet Francis as a tidy legend, a merchant's son born about 1181 in Assisi, a pleasure-loving youth who, after a mystical experience, renounces his inheritance and embraces Lady Poverty. He wanders the Umbrian hills, ministers to lepers, and draws around him a band of brothers. They live simply. They preach love. They praise God in birdsong. He tames a wolf through compassion. He receives the stigmata, visible marks of Christ confirming his sanctity. The story frames him as a corrective force, a tender reformer who reminded a worldly church of Jesus' call to humility. In classrooms, in stained glass windows and Christmas pageants, Francis is a parable, humility made human. Films show a smiling man in a rough robe, cradling sparrows. Nativity scenes import that image, and garden statues sell it by the thousands. Museums hang canvases where he kneels gently before the Pope, acceptance painted like a seal of approval. The image is smooth. It comforts. It explains why the Church, wise and merciful, could welcome a reformer and let him work within the structure of Rome. Hear how the official story speaks in confident tones, voices that shaped textbooks and sermons. A schoolteacher might say, Francis humbled himself before the Church and thus renewed it from within. A parish pamphlet will claim, his poverty showed us the gospel's heart. Even the Pope blessed him. A documentary narrator intones, from the messiness of the Middle Ages, Saint Francis emerged as proof that true holiness could flourish under papal guidance. Those lines are compact and persuasive. They tidy a complicated life into a moral template. Radical, yes, yet ultimately loyal and contained. The official Francis is useful. He reassures parishioners that radicalism can be domesticated. He reassures rulers that critique can be absorbed. He reassures artists that sanctity is picturesque. In short, he is safe. The convenience is not accidental. Think for a moment who benefits from the tidy version. Churches like a saint who praises poverty while allowing the institution to keep its wealth. Monarchs and local lords like a saint who criticizes private greed while leaving public authority intact. Pilgrimage economies profit from a loving, photogenic saint whose shrines attract the faithful and tourists alike. And the culture industry, books, movies, garden statuary has a perfect, marketable mascot. The official myth is tidy because it must be. It explains, soothes, and sells. Visualize the canonical scenes the sanitized story provides. A fresco cycle shows Francis in gentle frames, preaching to birds on a tranquil hillside, receiving a corpus of miracles in golden light, humbly kneeling before an approving pope. These images do important work. They convert a messy history into an iconography that people can clasp like a talisman. The story becomes not just taught but seen, and seeing is believing. Yet the smoothness hides seams. The official account erases tension, collapses conflict, mutes dissent. It compresses years of debate and crisis into a single tidy arc where the Church is simultaneously criticized and vindicated. This is an efficient narrative. It is also a rehearsed absence. Missing are the pages that make historians frown, the letters the Church would rather not parade, the voices of brothers pushed aside. You learned Francis as a corrective voice inside the Church. But if you look at early documents, that portrait begins to unravel. The official story will soon feel too comfortable. And when comfort is too fast, suspicion grows. What else was smoothed out, and by whom? Before we move on, a short word from the people making this investigation. Thank you for watching this deep dive. This channel is new, and every subscription helps us keep digging into stories history taught you to love and to question. If you like explanations that unsettle the tidy versions, stay with us. We're just getting started. Now, the myth will be unstitched. The first scratch in the varnish appears almost like a misfiled manuscript. You open a closet in the archive and the light falls on a different Francis. Not the pastel saint of nativity scenes, but a man who argued openly with bishops, whose followers quarreled among themselves, whose documents refused to conform neatly to later summaries. To understand how big the discrepancy is, you need to compare sources' early biographies, papal documents, the rule Francis wrote, private letters, and pay attention to what changes, who edits, and what vanishes. Start with the biographies. Within 3 years of Francis's death, Thomas of Celano, commissioned by Francis's early circle, penned a Vita, an account meant to record the extraordinary life of their founder. Read Celano's first telling, and you get a Francis who is electric with discontent about clerical privilege. He is brusque with priests. He is suspicious of ecclesiastical wealth. He is occasionally violent in his denunciations. Now compare that early Celano with later hagiographies, those polished, church-sanctioned lives that become the basis for canonized legend, and something has been steadily sanded away. Details that suggest public conflict with ecclesiastical authorities are softened or reinterpreted. Phrases implying rejection of clerical power are rephrased to suggest humility and obedience. This pattern, the earliest, raw accounts showing friction, and later, domesticated narratives insisting on submission, should make you ask a simple question. If Francis truly intended to stay comfortably inside church structures, why would his first chronicler stress conflict? It is possible that early writers simply emphasized drama. It is also possible, and historically plausible, that later editors rewrote memories to fit a version of Francis that served a different purpose. Turn next to the rule Francis proposed. Around 1209, he took to Rome a short, radical text, a way of life insisting on absolute poverty, itinerancy, and ministry without ecclesiastical trappings. The rule as submitted read like a manifesto. It stressed that brothers should possess nothing individually, not even a simple bag, and that they should not accept endowments. Read that original tone, and you begin to see the threat it posed. An order that refused both private and institutional wealth could not easily be folded into the Church's property-based economy. Yet the rule that eventually received papal approval was not identical. It had been carefully revised. Clauses that could be read as a frontal critique of ecclesiastical structures were softened, regulated, or qualified. The papal bull that validated the order came with provisos, controls, oversight, and a relationship of dependence. Why would the papacy accept a movement only after insisting on institutional checks? Because an unregulated band of radical mendicants threatened not only local bishops, but the whole fiscal and symbolic fabric of Christendom. A movement that refused property could be read, by some, as refusing the Church as an earthly power. Here is a precise document-level puzzle. The papal approbation contains odd appendages, phrases that limit the order's independence and effectively place it under protection. The term protect reads polite on paper. In practice, it meant surveillance. It meant the Church kept a hand on the order's neck. If the Francis of legend really wanted nothing more than to reassure Rome, Why would the papacy insist on such curbs? Another fissure opens when you look at what happened to Francis's followers who would not bend. Within a few decades, a group of so-called spirituals Franciscans who insisted on living according to the original, uncompromising standards were increasingly marginalized. Some were imprisoned, exiled, or accused of heresy. Men like Peter John Olivi and Angelo Clarino, figures not commonly named in the sentimental renderings of Francis, sat at the receiving end of punishments that included execution for some. Why would followers of a holy man be treated as heretics? Because their insistence on the founder's radical demands looked like a challenge to ecclesiastical order. The same passion that inspired leper care and barefoot preaching could, in another light, be read as the seed of social rupture. These are not tidy accusations. They are fragments of human drama, brothers who refused comfortable compromise and paid for it. They are also evidence that the Franciscan story was contested from the start, not a single uncomplicated thread. In short, the historical record holds early testimonies of conflict and later institutional silences that cannot be dismissed as mere quirk. Look now at the visual record. Art matters because it shapes memory. Early, independent depictions sometimes show Francis in confrontation head warp with bishops, gestures that suggest outrage at clerical excess. Later, commissioned frescoes present another Francis entirely, a saintly figure kneeling before the Pope, his radicalism visually domesticated. Giotto cycles, for instance, elevate particular moments, the stigmata, the sermon to the birds, while relegating ecclesiastical confrontations to near invisibility. Art was used as a corrective. Paintings became a pedagogy. The public did not read closed archives, they read walls. And when your history is painted in the cathedral, it becomes harder to question. Sources and silences. Historians pay attention to both. If you place a stack of documents on a table, the gaps between pages are as telling as the ink. Which texts survive? Which get ordered into libraries? The pattern of preservation suggests intentionality. In the decades after Francis's death, manuscripts that emphasized his alignment with Rome found favor and were copied more widely. Dissenting accounts either stayed local or were suppressed. By the mid-13th century, orders issued by Franciscan leadership directed that only selected biographies, Bonaventures in particular, should be disseminated broadly. The instruction was blunt: let certain voices dominate the archive, let the rest be buried. There is also the matter of timing. Canonization is a form of narrative hygiene. Pope Gregory IX, who had played a direct role in the order's governance and had faced the tensions firsthand as Cardinal Ugolino, expedited Francis's canonization just 2 years after his death. That speed was extraordinary and strategic. A rapid saint-making process extinguishes controversy before it can calcify into alternative traditions. Canonization locks memory into liturgical forms and official texts. When Gregory declared Francis a saint, he did more than honor a holy man. He placed the brand of sanctity on a story that he, as Pope, had influence over reshaping. And why would the papacy find value in that brand? Because the Church, like any enduring institution, learns to neutralize potential disruptors by converting them into emblematic endorsements. A charismatic critic who could rally the poor and embarrass bishops could be transformed into a beloved saint whose image reinforces obedience among the faithful. The canonized figure becomes a kind of institutional Trojan horse. The Church credits itself with recognizing holiness, and, in doing so, co-opts the very energy that might have energized dissent. Of course, not every historian accepts the most conspiratorial readings. Some argue the changes were natural. The order grew fast, new administrative needs required new rules, and the Church's interventions were bureaucratic responses to growth rather than political subterfuge. There are shades of plausibility here. Growth forces compromise. The practicalities of feeding thousands, providing shelter, and negotiating with local lords meant that some doctrinal absolutes had to become flexible. But even if compromises were pragmatic, the way they were justified, codified, and then memorialized tells another story. Institutional survival often depends less on destroying dissent than on repackaging it. Consider the human texture of these choices. Brother Leo, Francis's secretary and companion, left a record of intimate moments, episodes of ecstatic devotion, sudden journeys into solitude, prophetic pronouncements. Those personal notes show a man who believed he spoke for Christ, whose visions had force. Some brothers found comfort in that force, others found fear. If charisma can create cohesion, it can also create splintering. When the center of gravity is a prophet rather than an office, movements often end in factionalism. The Vatican, pragmatic as it was, faced a decision: crush the prophet and risk martyrdom, or clasp him and domesticate the martyr's appeal. It chose the latter. Another small but revealing detail: the witnesses in the early records sometimes quote Francis saying things that are political as much as spiritual. Phrases like, "Christ has no vicar on earth," are incendiary if reported accurately. To assert that Christ has no vicar is to challenge the theological foundation of papal authority. Now, these quotations are disputed source. Critical scholars debate their authenticity and interpretive weight. But even if some of these phrases were hyperbolic, the fact that such words circulated early on indicates the tenor of the confrontation. This was not merely a personal poverty program. It touched the institutional nerve. Finally, consider the swift, ruthless fate of dissenters who refused to be conformed. The spiritual Franciscans did not simply ask for purer poverty. They exposed the contradiction of a mighty church owning vast lands, raising revenues, and building monuments in a name that preached poverty. To many at the top, that contradiction was intolerable. The result: policy changes, inquisitorial actions, and, in extreme cases, executions. These responses recast spiritual rigor as heresy. The rhetoric of orthodoxy did what it often does. It morphed a political problem into a theological crime, thereby broadening the Church's powers of punishment. So we return to our uneasy conclusion. There are two Francises in the archive. One is a prophetic, apocalyptic voice that unsettled power by insisting on a gospel lived without hierarchical comforts. The other is the Francis the Church fashioned, a domesticated emblem that reproved private greed but left institutional structures intact. Which is the real man? History rarely offers pure answers. What it does offer are layers, documents that contradict, art that rewrites, policies that punish, and canons that seal a memory. The honest view is composite. A charismatic, sometimes unstable man whose message could be read as reform or rebellion, and an institution adept at transforming that energy into durable legend. The first cracks are no longer mere curiosities. They look like traces of a campaign to alter not just a movement, but a memory. And if an institution could do that so thoroughly in the 13th century, what else might it have polished away in other ages and other stories? The next sections will dig deeper into the backstage machinery, but for now the simple fact remains. The official story you thought you knew contains holes. Those holes are the invitation to look closer and to question how memory becomes myth. Behind every public miracle there is a room where people argue, file papers, count coins, and whisper warnings. To understand the real Francis, you have to spend time in those rooms, not the painted chapels where he kneels sanctified, but the cramped cells, the kitchens, the corridors where decisions were made and tempers flared. The image of a barefoot prophet stepping lightly across fields is true in one register. In another, harder register, he ran a fast-growing movement built on charisma, ritual, and tightly enforced discipline. That combination produces devotion and it produces coercion. Picture a cold winter morning in a courtyard outside a Franciscan friary. The wind cuts across the stone, breath fogs in the air. A handful of brothers huddle with mugs of watered wine. One of them is Brother Leo, the man who will later be remembered as Francis's secretary and near constant chat. She loved Francis, sat at his feet in public, and secretly supplied food and shelter when the brothers had none. Imagine a wealthy woman leaving a silk scarf on a doorpost. A brother slips it into his sleeve at dusk and feels guilt and relief at once. That relief reveals the unavoidable contradiction. To sustain radical poverty as a visible norm, the community accepted secret flows of money. The secrecy mattered. Public possession was the sin. Private aid was a necessary lifeline. Everyone learned to live in that paradox. Inside the brotherhood, Francis's intensity created both loyalty and surveillance. The founders' rituals of mortification, hair shirts, sleeping on the ground, deliberate self-exposure to cold were not simply private penitence. They were acts that modeled radical commitment. They set a scale. Brothers measured each other against that scale. Those who flinched at the cold, who accepted a blanket, who took a loaf were marked. Over time, that marking turned into competition. Who could endure the most? Who could produce the most visible humility? In a small community, such competitions reshape power. The man who can suffer most acquires moral authority. He becomes less open to debate. When some brothers suggested practical adjustments, a modest shelter here, a small donation there, the reaction was often not reasoned debate, but spiritual alarm. Francis, according to multiple near-contemporary accounts, did not negotiate. He entered trances. He announced prophetic judgments. He framed compromise as spiritual infection. Those who pleaded for temperance were accused of being corrupted by the world, language that carried the weight of eternal consequences. The pattern is familiar to anyone who has seen charismatic movements grow. Initial consent becomes rigid orthodoxy. Dissent becomes betrayal. And betrayal in a religious context has a theological intensity to it. It is not merely wrong. It is complicit with evil. There is another side to the backstage story. Francis as a political animal. This is not the calculation of a cynical courtier. It is a sober recognition that movements exist in a political field. Italy in the early 13th century was a tangle of municipal power, princely houses, and papal politics. Francis and his brothers had to travel through that tangle. They met bishops suspicious of mendicants who preached without formal permission. They encountered towns that resented itinerant groups who begged and preached in the streets. And they navigated imperial papal divides where siding with one lord could be dangerous. Francis learned to cultivate patrons for survival. He did not do so with the mechanical coldness of a bureaucrat. He did so with the urgency of someone who believed the cause would otherwise die. That choice to accept support from nobles would later become one of the Church's favorite accusations of hypocrisy, but at the time, it was necessary. Psychology and prophecy intertwine in the archive. Modern scholars sometimes read Francis's episodes of extreme asceticism through clinical lenses. Symptoms of PTSD after capture and battle. Manic episodes triggered by spiritual exaltation. Obsessive tendencies given theological sanctification. Those readings are hypotheses, not verdicts. The sources cannot supply modern diagnoses. Yet the behavior is there in the texture of the records. Days without sleep, fasting to the brink of collapse, ecstatic utterances that reconfigure doctrine in a single sentence. These are not anomalies. They are structural to the movement's dynamism. Charisma sustains growth. Charisma also destabilizes governance. This dynamism produced real costs. As the movement enlarged beyond a handful of followers, fractures multiplied. Men like Peter John Olivi, later associated with rigorist wings, pushed the Franciscan ideal to extremities that alarmed both civic authorities and the papacy. Angelo Clarino led groups that kept to the founders' strictest prescriptions and became unauthorized in the eyes of church structures. The reaction of the institution and of moderate Franciscans who wanted to preserve a working relationship with bishops was decisive. Rigorists were isolated, their writings censored. Some were arrested, others exiled. These were not small administrative corrections. They were acts that split spiritual community and imposed a choice: conform to institutional compromise or stand outside, exposed to accusation. In the quieter rooms where paperwork gathered dust, Francis's own directives are revealing. His testament, a ragged text preserved in multiple fragments, reads like a guerrilla manifesto of poverty. He forbids house building in stone. He opposes seeking papal privileges. He warns against the accumulation of goods, whether communal or personal. These are not gestures of theatrical purity. They are strategic choices intended to keep the order mobile and dependent on local goodwill, not on landed wealth. Read in context. Such prescriptions threaten the economic tissue of the medieval church, which relied on property, tithes, and fixed assets to fund services and power. A band of men who refused land ownership undermined the circulatory system of ecclesiastical finance. You learn St. Francis as a corrective figure inside the church. Now imagine for a moment what would have happened if the order had stayed strictly to this testament for centuries. No basilicas, no central revenues. Thousands of brothers wandering, utterly dependent on local spontaneous charity. That shape of Christianity would have been hard to govern. It would have produced a rougher, less hierarchical Christianity. It is this possibility that made church officials nervous, and it helps explain the intense efforts that followed to domesticate the movement. Finally, one cannot tell the backstage story without noting how quickly memory can be curated. Brother Leo's notebooks and Thomas of Celano's early Vita preserve vivid, unedited moments of anger, of intestinal conflict, of prophetic flair. But other documents vanish. Letters get edited. Biographies get reorganized. The choice of what to copy and what to discard is itself an act of shaping posterity. In the decades after Francis's death, those choices were increasingly centralized. Pages that emphasized confrontation with bishops, that quoted incendiary phrases, are scarcer in the later tradition. The scarcity is not accidental. It is one more clue that the Francis we have in stained glass is the result of decisions made by people who knew how dangerous the original could be. If you are following this carefully, one thing should be clear. The backstage life of the movement was complex, often ruthless, and driven by fear as much as by faith. And from those rooms, from the whispers, the secret donations, the expulsions, and the late-night ecstasies, the public saint would be carved, smoothed, and gilded. But before that gilding, there was friction. That friction would eventually explode in a public confrontation that changed everything. The single scene that crystallizes the tension between Francis and church power is not a miracle story. It is a rowdy, dusty meeting beneath a sky that has the feel of heat and consequence. Think of a makeshift assembly by the river or on a field of mats, hundreds of brothers gathered, their robes uneven, their faces sunburnt. The year is 1223. The place is near Assisi. The order has become thousands strong. What began as a compact of wandering men has reached a scale that attracts attention from Rome. Enter Cardinal Ugolino, a man in clerical finery who will soon wear the tiara as Pope Gregory IX. He represents the papal curia. He carries not only robes, but the weight of an institution that depends on regulation. He also carries experience. As cardinal, he has already seen and negotiated movements that threaten church cohesion. For him, the Franciscan experiment is both an opportunity and a risk. He can authorize what will be a loyal instrument of the church, or he can extinguish a movement that refuses to be managed. And he is not alone in his calculation. Bishops across Italy complain about preachers who speak without sanction. Urban magistrates grumble about crowds and disorder. The papacy, in short, is facing a political problem disguised as a spiritual movement. The meeting is billed as an organizational chapter, perhaps even as a peaceful recalibration of rules. Brothers sit on mats, shifting, rubbing legs that have walked miles. Francis, now an older man, arrives, but not as a bureaucrat. He arrives as a prophet with a mission. He has already written a version of the rule, a terse text that insists on radical poverty. That phrase, if authentic, is incendiary. It cuts at the theological root of papal authority. To say the Pope is not Christ's vicar is to suggest the papacy is a human institution, not the divine mediator it claimed to be. Whether Francis spoke the phrase precisely, or whether the phrase was amplified by later retellers to dramatize the conflict, is debated. But the mere circulation of such a sentence in the immediate aftermath of the chapter shows the tenor of the confrontation. It was not an argument about logistics. It was an argument about the meaning of authority. Ugolino reacts not simply as a courteous official, but as a man who must contain a risk. He offers a form of protection, a paradoxical term that on paper reads benign. On practice, it centralizes oversight. The Pope's protector becomes the order's legal guardian. That guardianship is framed as charity and oversight, but functions as control. The Church would not crush Francis. It would contain him. It would canonize his devotion while regulating his movement. That regulatory logic explains both compassion and coercion. By embracing Francis and his followers formally, the papacy could channel popular devotion while avoiding social rupture. The immediate aftermath of the chapter was devastating for Francis personally. Contemporary sources, some sympathetic, some hostile, describe a man exhausted. His health, never robust, began to fail. The strain of asceticism, the sleepless nights, the battles with officials, all take a toll. He is no longer the energetic itinerant of earlier years, but a figure who must cede more authority than he likes. He is sent on missions, hosted in monasteries, kept away from the central administrative meetings that now decide the order's future. The rhetoric of obedience masks a reality of sidelining. The political calculus is sharp. For the papacy, marginalizing Francis's uncompromising followers had the twin effects of neutralizing a potential rival and preserving institutional unity. For many brothers, the choice was agonizing. Accept curial protection and live with compromise, or stand with Francis and risk exile and accusation. The result, predictably, is schism. Those who insist on original poverty, the spirituals, and others are pushed to the margins. Some are arrested, some are tried. A few suffer executions in later decades when the disputes escalate into heresy trials. It is a trajectory that begins with a single meeting of mats and ends with prisons and burned manuscripts. One striking detail, the change in physical spaces. Where brothers had once slept rough, they begin to move into hospices and later into monumental spaces. Where they had preached on street corners, they are invited into churches and planned liturgies. Material culture follows legal culture. By the mid-13th century, the order's centers are stone-built, endowed and visually impressive ironically, sometimes built with the funds Francis said should never be used. Those basilicas become the public face of a movement that had been explicitly organized against such displays. The cognitive dissonance is painful. It reveals how quickly institutional needs can recast a movement's aesthetic. The episode also rewrites authority language. The original rhetoric of Francis of radical poverty, of immediate personal relation to Christ, does not disappear. It is folded into a larger lexicon that makes room for obedience. Phrases that might earlier have meant a refusal of ecclesiastical power become reframed as humility before ecclesiastical office. The transformation is subtle but profound. Charisma is domesticated, and dissent is relabeled as disobedience, then heresy. The vocabulary shifts, and with it the arsenal of punishment. And yet the crackdown is not total at this early stage. The papacy sees utility in keeping the movement popular. Gregory's canonization of Francis in 1228 is not merely an act of piety, it is statecraft. To make Francis a saint quickly is to fix his image before rival versions solidify. The rapid canonization seals a narrative. Francis, the Church says, was ultimately obedient, holy, and sanctioned. The more radical scenes the public ripping of documents. The Christ has no vicar moments are inconvenient to this narrative. They are quieted. You have seen this dramatic thread before, in whispers and in fragments. Here it is fully visible. A charismatic founder pushed to the side, while institutions extract, repurpose, and rebrand his movement. The chapter of mats is the fulcrum. What happens on that field of rugs is not simply a quarrel about rules. It is a test case for how medieval power would handle modern charismatic threats. The outcome shapes not only Francis's fate, but the template the Church will follow again and again: co-opt, control, canonize. Yet even as the institutional engines applied pressure, the memory of what was argued on those mats did not die. It circulated in suppressed letters, in the exiled spirituals' laments, in the gnawing dissonance felt by many brothers. That dissonance would later erupt in prosecutions and intellectual fights. The public story would be neat. The private memory would be unsettled. And the unsettled memory is where the truth, if you look closely, still glows. Propaganda is rarely a single machine. It is a network: writers, artists, officials, patrons, and later, educators who together smooth rough edges into a palatable image. The Church's work to recast Francis begins almost immediately after his death. Canonization is the first major instrument: fast, performative, and binding. In 1228, Gregory IX moves quickly. The process is lightning fast by medieval standards: 2 years, and for good reason. Speed prevents rival traditions from calcifying. It allows Rome to endorse one portrait before competing ones spread too widely. Grabbing the narrative begins with controlling texts. Gregory commissions Thomas of Celano, one of the earliest biographers, to produce an official vita. Celano's brief, when you read administrative correspondence and later directives, is instructive. Highlight miracles, stress obedience, place the founder within the Church's interpretive frame. Where Celano's early drafts may have retained sharper episodes of conflict, his subsequent versions soften them. Edits, omissions, and rephrasings accumulate. The work is not necessarily conspiratorial in the lurid modern sense. It also looks like damage control. Yet the result is the same: a flattened story. A next and decisive move is the systematic management of archives and texts. In 1266, the Franciscan General Chapter makes an act that is chilling for historians. It privileges the biography of Bonaventure as the official life and orders that other, competing accounts be suppressed. That instruction is functionally an act of library politics. Manuscripts do not disappear by accident in the Middle Ages. Copying is an expensive, deliberate act. To stop copying a text is to guarantee its eventual oblivion. This policy: choose one memory and lock the rest away, is shorthand for how institutions choose their histories. But words alone do not make saints. The Church understood that visual culture is a pedagogy. Paintings teach where books fail. Murals teach the illiterate more effectively than Latin treatises. So the campaign to refashion Francis moves into frescoes and altarpieces. Early, independent depictions, images that show Francis arguing with bishops, that preserve gestures of confrontation, are marginalized. In their place come commissioned cycles, images of a serene, bird-whispering Francis, of the tender visit to lepers, of the stigmata glowing like a divine seal. Giotto's frescoes in Assisi are the crowning achievement of this aesthetic program. They are not a neutral artist's homage. They are a visual shorthand. They teach the faithful which moments to remember and, just as importantly, which moments to forget. The stigmata offers a peculiar case study in re-signification. To followers present at the event, the wounds might have seemed like direct divine endorsement of Francis's uncompromising path. To the institution, the stigmata needed a different gloss. Rather than a rejection of ecclesiastical mediation, it was reframed as affirmation of the Church's capacity to recognize sanctity. The miraculous hand is made to point back to Rome. The interpretive labor here is subtle. The same physical mark that might radicalize popular sentiment is narrated as validation of church authority. Schools, preaching manuals, and liturgical calendars propagate a version of Francis through centuries of catechesis. Children memorize sanitized episodes. Sermons borrow the comfortable tropes. Playful images Francis with birds are stamped into popular imagination. Over generations, the radical edge blunts. The saint becomes a safe exemplar in civic rituals and national myth-making. His image is plucked from the disputatious field and placed on a pedestal designed to ennoble, not trouble. What happens to the dissenters? The spirituals who held fast to the original uncompromising poverty become the story's casualties. Some are exiled, others are censured, some jailed. A few are executed in the heat of later inquisitorial fervor. Their martyrdom, when it occurs, is rarely remembered in mainstream church histories. Instead, their names survive in buried letters, in suppressed treatises, in the pale notes of private libraries. Those marginal archives are a historian's treasure trove precisely because they were intentionally deprived of institutional support. That intentional silence is proof of how thoroughly the machine operated. The propaganda apparatus also knows the value of taste. Images, hymns, and biographies are refined to fit the sensory expectations of the faithful. Colors that soothe, language that builds paternal feelings, imagery that avoids the uncomfortable. The result is not mere censorship. It is an imposing of an aesthetic logic that says, this is what sanctity looks like. Over time, that aesthetic becomes normative. It is taught, copied, and sold. Garden statues of Francis with birds are not the accident of devotional whimsy. They are the product of an entire supply chain that turned a contested life into a consumable commodity. You may wonder how intentional all this was. Historians disagree. Some see a pragmatic institution adapting to growth. Others see deliberate political actors sanitizing a problem. The truth is probably both. Institutions are pragmatists. They also understand narratives. They know that saints can either destabilize power or stabilize it. The rapid canonization, the selection of official biographies, the commissioning of art, and the enforcement of a particular visual and textual grammar, these are acts with immediate benefit. They turned a charismatic challenge into a brand. And brands are stabilizing. The final piece of the machine is the slow accretion of meaning. Each repetition, a sermon, a fresco, a school textbook, layers new interpretation onto the old. Lies or omissions need not be dramatic. Repetition polishes them into facticity. By the 14th and 15th centuries, most people think they know Francis from the murals on cathedral walls and the sermon on a Sunday morning. The more transgressive episodes survive only in marginal notes and advanced scholarship. Yet even after centuries of careful sculpting, the original tensions never completely disappear. In quiet corners of Franciscan houses, in forgotten letters, in the stubborn practices of more rigorous branches, echoes of the founder's harshest demands persist. That persistence is what made the saint dangerous for his contemporaries and what keeps him interesting for us. The memory management worked very well, better than any bureaucrat might have hoped, but it was never perfect. Contested memory leaks. If you look at the Francis now, polished and domesticated, and then flip open a suppressed manuscript or a raw early Vita, you feel the friction of history. The Church's operation of appropriation was efficient, strategic, and enduring. It took a prophet who threatened to unsettle ecclesiastical order and converted him into a saint whose image served that order. The process was moralized as pious care. It was also a form of soft political mastery. And the strategy did not end with Francis. Once the template existed, canonize quickly, centralize biographies, commission art, institutionalize offices, marginalize rigorous, it could be applied again and again. The Church learned to produce saints who reinforced institutional narratives rather than undermined them. The Francis story became a case study, a handbook of sorts, for neutralizing charismatic risk. That realization should make the viewer uneasy. The same mechanisms that sanctify can also domesticate, conceal, and, in subtle ways, lie. So when you walk past a statue of Francis with a bird nestled in his hand, or when you hear a Sunday homily that quotes him on poverty, remember two things. First, those images and texts are the result of choices. Second, there are other choices, other texts, other memories, other brothers exiled for insisting on what the founder wrote that did not make it into the square. The myth that comforts you has a seam. Pull it gently, and you will find people who paid a steep price to hold to the version of Francis that rarely appears in stained glass. What remains is neither simple condemnation nor simple praise. It is a story about power, memory, and the ways institutions make saints useful. The Church did not simply rewrite Francis to flatter itself. It also used his image to preserve social order, to fund worship, to teach virtue. That pragmatic, sometimes ruthless calculus is part of history's truth. And it is exactly the kind of truth that makes saints more human and institutions more vulnerable to the charge that they, too, manufacture what we call holiness. Strip away the glossy frescoes and the garden statues, and the man who emerges is not a one-dimensional caricature. He is wound of contradictions, mystic and manager, mendicant and magnet for money, visionary and disciplinarian. To call him merely a saint or a heretic is to flatten a life that, in the rawest sources, reads more like a political catechism than a children's story. Begin with the facts scholars accept. Francesco Bernard I was born around 1181 in Assisi. In his 30s, he forsook his father's cloth trading business and gathered companions. In 1209, a version of a rule reached Pope Innocent III and received papal assent. He died in 1226 and was canonized by Gregory IX in 1228. Those are the scaffolding dates most histories use. The insistence that matters most is what he meant by poverty and what he did to hold a movement to it. In the ordinary story, poverty is a spiritual posture, humility before God, an imitation of Christ. In the more uncomfortable reading, it is a totalizing program, a system of behavior, an organizational discipline, a test of loyalty. Francis's insistence on renouncing property was not a quaint ascetic preference. It functioned as a polemical weapon against the structures he believed corrupted the gospel. Bishops with lands, monastic houses accepting endowments, clergy whose wealth insulated them from suffering. Imagine Francis not merely preaching, but auditing. The visual material left to us suggests a founder who measured obedience in bodily terms. How a brother dressed, how he begged, what hands touched the bowl. Those are small acts that, repeated, become a regime. A brother who accepted a roof, even temporarily, had compromised the order's identity. To Francis, doctrinal purity and practical form were the same thing. This is why the disputes with moderates were not personalities clashing, they were quarrels about whether the movement would remain a living protest or become another landed body. He was, in many accounts, charismatic to the point of coercion. Witnesses describe charismatic episodes, trances, visions, sudden condemnations, but also a tactical intelligence. He cultivated patrons like Jacopo de Cetesoli, who provided hospitality and influence. He accepted help without apparently allowing it to reframe his rhetoric. This is not hypocrisy so much as a paradox he never resolved. How to live without property while relying on people with resources. He solved it by ceremony, by rules, and by rhetorical pressure. The appearance of renunciation could be sustained while alliances were forged in shadow. Psychological readings are tempting and sometimes persuasive. Francis's wartime imprisonment and illness, his extreme fasts and self-flagellation, his periods of retreat on Mount La Verna, all these map onto patterns modern clinicians might tag as vulnerability to dissociative states. But the documentary record insists on restraint. visions, and radical acts had social consequences. When he stripped in the public square or denounced clerics, those were moves meant to realign a crowd. They were public theology performed as theater. Whether they came from an inner compulsion or an intentional strategy, his later years show concessions that read like tactical retreats, journeys requested by the papacy, negotiations over the rule, acceptance of nominal oversight. Those concessions were never wholehearted. They read like containment politics, Francis giving some ground to preserve the core. He knew the cost of total rupture: exile, extermination, oblivion. He tried to steer between endurance and annihilation. One must keep a strict line between what evidence supports and what later interpreters piled upon it. Certain phrases attributed to him, "Christ has no vicar on earth," are suspiciously dramatic and may be amplifications. Yet whether Francis actually uttered those words or not, the sentiment fits a pattern: a person suspicious of centralized ecclesiastical mediation. He wanted a direct conduit to the divine that bypassed institutional tiers. That posture is revolutionary in an era where spiritual and temporal authorities were entwined. So we are left with a composite: a man whose compassion for lepers and the poor was real, and whose methods could be uncompromisingly severe. A prophet who preached tenderness but demanded pain. A reformer who made poverty into a tool as exacting as law. The honest portrait refuses the tidy bookshelf label. It accepts a man who compelled devotion and also expelled the hesitant, who courted nobles while attacking clerical wealth, who became both a mirror and a threat to an ecclesial order that could not easily absorb such uncompromising critique. This reconstruction is uncomfortable because it relies on human motives, not saintly archetypes. It invites you to see Francis as an actor whose choices created both good and harm, saints who stabilize institutions and founders who unsettle them, sometimes in the same breath. The Real Francis was a founder of systems: spiritual, social, and political, and systems, by their nature, exert pressure on people. That pressure produced loyalty and fracture, miracles and martyrs, canonization and purges. The portrait is complicated because the consequences were, and because the institution that would later sanctify him had to domesticate all of that energy to survive. One more truth is unavoidable. If Francis had been less uncompromising, his movement might have softened into irrelevance. If he had been more ruthless, it might have been erased. The version we never learned in school is a man who navigated, with grim determination, the narrow corridor between prophetic risk and institutional survival, and who, in doing so, became the seed of both sanctity and schism. But the question that remains open and urgent is whether the sacrifices demanded in his name preserved a prophetic edge or killed it. That question is what drives us into the present. The consequences of this contested life did not stop at tombside. Francis's afterlife, literally the world built around his name, became a field where politics, art, law, and commerce met and rewrote each other. To understand the living Francis, look at the basilicas, the frescoes, the monastic ledgers, the court papers. Each is a palimpsest of decisions that remade an inconvenient voice into a useful institution. Start with space. Francis forbade stone churches. The church built 2 great basilicas in Assisi. Walk the nave of San Francesco and note the ironies. The saint who scorned permanence is now housed in one of medieval Europe's most permanent statements of ecclesiastical power. The basilicas were not only devotional centers, they were megaphones of curated memory. Pilgrims brought money, artisans brought skills, merchants built economies around relic veneration. Where once poverty meant itinerancy, it became the source of tourism and revenue. Architecture turned protest into platform. Paintings completed the work words began. Giotto's cycles in Assisi did more than narrate a holy life. They taught through image which moments were safe to remember. In Giotto's frescoes, Francis kneels in pious humility, The more unvarnished episodes confronting bishops, tearing up documents, disputing papal delegates are absent or softened. Images are fast education for the illiterate majority. The cycles were curriculum. Over decades, the visual grammar of sanctity hardened. A saintly body with birds, a saintly embrace of lepers, a saintly wound. Each repetition deepened a public expectation. Sanctity looks like serenity. Texts were manipulated with similar care. Gregory IX's swift canonization allowed Rome to set the terms of the story early. Commissioning Thomas of Celano to write an official life was literal narrative control. Celano's first drafts retained sharper, more ambivalent material that later drafts smoothed. Then Bonaventure's Vita, chosen as the official account by the Franciscan order in 1266, was elevated while alternatives were suppressed. The deliberate privileging of one account over many is not a neutral act. It is archive politics. Stop copying a text in the medieval world and you sentence it to oblivion. And law did what art and text could not. It changed practice. Papal bulls and privileges created legal categories the founder had fought. Protectors, exemptions, and congregational rights transformed mendicant practice into an entity able to hold property, sometimes in trust, to build houses, to operate hospitals. Legal architecture allowed the church to contain the order and, simultaneously, to profit from its popularity. These were conscious trade-offs. Preserve the dynasty of devotion, limit the unruly edges. Who benefited? The answers are pragmatic. Popes gained a popular saint whose image could validate the institution. Bishops gained new preaching orders to staff dioceses and generate morality plays. Craftsmen and merchants gained customers. The order itself gained durability and reach. For many poor people, Franciscans provided real relief. Yet these gains came at the cost of the order's original affront to institutional wealth. The machine operated in layers. Early canonical decisions shaped hagiography. Hagiography shaped art. Art shaped popular devotion. Devotion financed more art and more legal privileges. The loop is industrial and self-reinforcing. Repeat images and phrases across decades, and you produce an orthodoxy that feels organic. That is why the sanitized Francis felt inevitable to generations raised on fresco cycles and feast day sermons. But erasure left residues. The spirituals, those who insisted on literal poverty, did not vanish quietly. They were persecuted, marginalized, sometimes killed. Their texts were proscribed. Their letters circulated in limited clandestine circles. Yet where the institutional memory cut away branches, grassroots memory preserved them. Hidden margins of manuscripts, personal notebooks, provincial courts record a different Francis, one closer to the founder's austerity. These leaks matter because they kept alive the possibility that the sanitized image was a historical choice, not destiny. The modern echoes are striking and persistent. When Cardinal Bergoglio adopted the name Francis in 2013, the choice sent a ripple through the Vatican and the world. For progressives, the name invoked critique and solidarity with the poor. For conservatives, it was a reminder that the founder's rhetoric could unsettle clerical comforts. The name alone reopened the old binary: Francis the radical versus Francis the domestic saint. Popular culture extended the sanitization into the present. Films, books, eco-friendly campaigns, and souvenir shops reinforced a narrow visual and moral script. The Francis who befriended animals is marketable. The Francis who accused clerics and court functionaries of venality is less so. The commodification of holiness is a modern chapter in a medieval book. The same engine of repetition that sanctified him centuries ago now brands him for retail. But the deeper legacy is methodological. Francis's story became a template for institutional absorption. Identify popular energy, codify it, commission official narratives, legalize privileges, marginalize the purists. The Church did not defeat Francis by erasing him. It took his potency and folded it into structures that outlived him. That pattern repeats across institutions everywhere. Movements that threaten power are rarely destroyed. They are domesticated. There is also a human residue. Families of persecuted spirituals, local devotions, anonymous marginal notes. These are not mere curiosities for specialists. They are moral fingerprints. Now ask yourself one question, blunt and simple. When you honor a historical figure, are you praising the person who lived with all their contradictions and violences, or the polished symbol someone built to make them safe for power? Thank you for staying with this investigation. If this unsettled you, subscribe and help us bring more recovered chapters to light. Tell us in the comments where you first learned about Francis' school, film, or church, and where you encountered a different story. There are more sealed files and smooth frescoes waiting. This episode is only one case in a long dossier.